The alien vessel settled through the dense canopy, piercing through the sunlight filtering between branches. The sleek, reflective armor of the extraterrestrial scouts gleamed in the sparse beams of sunlight, casting an eerie glow amidst the undergrowth. Commander Zor led the scouting team with a self-assured smirk on his scaled face, convinced that Earth, with its so-called primitives, would pose little resistance. His reports had described a people that once used sticks and stones to fight and now, even with some technology, were considered centuries behind his own kind. There was something almost quaint, even charming, in how humans still clung to outdated practices and hid among trees. But no matter, this would end swiftly. He would see to it that they were back to the ship by day's end. Beside him, his second-in-command, Hark, glanced around with sharp, calculating eyes, scanning the forest with an array of advanced detection tools. His face was set in a look of disdainful curiosity, a predator sizing up its inferior prey. His line scanners detected faint signs of life, barely enough to register any form of threat. A low, guttural laugh escaped him, amused at the futility of such lifeforms. "Primitive indeed," he muttered, his voice laced with a mixture of arrogance and dismissal. "These creatures don't even qualify as a threat." He chuckled, signaling for the group to begin their sweep. The scouts moved forward in practiced silence, their advanced cloaking technology rendering their steps almost soundless. Each movement was precise, calculated, their armor adjusting seamlessly to the terrain. But as they advanced deeper into the forest, an unsettling shift in the atmosphere began to emerge. The air felt thick, charged with an unseen presence. Commander Zor, catching the faintest sensation of being watched, dismissed it as environmental static. Earth was a backwater planet, a lesser world with even less impressive lifeforms. Why waste time on baseless instincts? Above them, hidden among the trees, Captain Hayes watched silently. Camouflaged in shades of the forest, his suit melded with the bark and leaves. His team was scattered through the trees, their positions carefully chosen to remain undetectable. They were trained for this terrain, skilled hunters with knowledge and instincts sharpened by years of survival in Earth's densest woodlands. The aliens, despite their technology, would not detect them. To these invaders, they were nothing more than shadows blending into the natural world. A slight shift in the breeze whispered through the trees, and Hayes caught the scent of metal, a sharp, unfamiliar tang carried on the wind. His team lay in wait, arrows drawn, tension mounting as they prepared for the signal. Their bows, carved from native wood and reinforced with carbon fiber, were relics in appearance but lethal in their effectiveness. The aliens below, for all their advanced armor and arrogance, would soon realize they were not the only predators in this forest. He leaned forward slightly, speaking in a low, almost inaudible voice into his headset. "Hold your positions," he whispered, each word carrying a calm authority that kept his team's nerves steely. Below, the aliens continued their systematic march, oblivious to the eyes tracking their every move. Their devices hummed softly, scanning for any trace of humanity, but the dense foliage interfered with their readings, causing occasional blips and static. Commander Zor grumbled, irritated by the interference, his visor flickering slightly as he attempted to recalibrate. Hark, noticing his leader's frustration, lifted a hand to signal a halt. "We should adjust the settings," he suggested, a hint of caution in his tone. But Zor waved him off impatiently. "They're mere animals, Hark," he snapped. "A few trees won't change anything. They are nothing." But Hark's gaze lingered on the surrounding trees, scanning the branches above with a growing unease. Though trained for such terrains, his instincts whispered a warning, one he could not yet articulate. From his position, Hayes observed the exchange, noting the aliens' reluctance and the subtle shift in their demeanor. He looked to his right, where Mason, the youngest of his squad and their best shot, was perched. A nod from Hayes was all it took. The forest held its breath as Mason released the first arrow, the weapon gliding silently through the air with lethal precision. It pierced the helmet of an alien soldier, embedding itself without a sound save for the soft thud as the body slumped to the forest floor. For a moment, silence reigned. The aliens froze, their heads snapping upward in confusion, scanning the treetops but finding nothing. Their bewilderment hung in the air like an open wound. Hark's voice broke the stillness, barking in order. Ambush! Prepare to engage! His weapon was drawn in an instant, eyes darting through the foliage, yet he could see nothing beyond dense leaves and twisted vines. Another arrow whistled through the air, followed closely by a third, striking with deadly accuracy. Panic set in among the aliens as they scrambled, firing erratically into the canopy, their energy blasts illuminating the forest in brief flashes but hitting nothing. Their once orderly formation descended into chaos, their advanced weaponry failing them as the humans stayed hidden, their precise attacks giving the aliens no time to react. Commander Zor's expression shifted from disdain to rage, a flicker of fear underlying his anger. He was a warrior, but this was a humiliation. This was not the victory he had envisioned. Desperation crept into his commands, the initial smug confidence replaced by frantic orders. "Stand your ground!" he yelled, his voice breaking as he struggled to reassert control. But his soldiers were scattered, their lines broken, and their morale splintered. Hayes and his team moved like shadows, their coordinated attacks keeping the aliens off balance. The forest responded to the invaders' every move, branches creaking as if the trees themselves were repelling the intrusion. From a new vantage point, Hayes could see Zor's desperation mounting, his attempts to regain order futile against an enemy he could neither see nor understand. The humans had claimed the upper hand, each arrow a silent declaration that this forest, this planet, would not be taken easily. With another signal from Hayes, his team unleashed a final barrage, their arrows raining down with unerring accuracy. The aliens' armor was no match, their soldiers collapsing in the underbrush, the once pristine metal now tarnished with mud and leaves. Those who remained standing staggered, their movements betraying their growing dread as they realized the depth of their miscalculation. Zor stumbled, his armor scraping against tangled roots, his breathing labored as he glanced around for support. All he saw were shadows and the grim realization that they were being hunted. The scales of power had shifted irrevocably, and for the first time, the once arrogant commander felt the icy grip of fear. The silence was shattered by Commander Zor's barked orders as he tried to rally his disoriented troops. Hark, his second-in-command, moved quickly to his side, scanning the treetops with narrowed eyes, but the humans had vanished into the dense foliage. The alien technology, sophisticated as it was, seemed to falter in this unfamiliar terrain. Hark adjusted his visor, attempting to recalibrate, yet it flickered as it struggled to handle the interference. The dense forest, with its tangle of roots and branches, was wreaking havoc on their systems, leaving the aliens with a sense of vulnerability they'd never known before. Above them, Hayes observed the aliens' confusion with a grim satisfaction. Every piece of the forest was a tool in his team's hands, every shadow and branch a potential weapon. It was time for the next move. Hayes raised a hand, signaling to his team to maintain their positions. They were scattered across the treetops, each carefully hidden. The aliens would see nothing but the occasional flutter of leaves, hear nothing but the whisper of the wind. A faint rustle signaled Mason, the squad's youngest but most skilled marksman, shifting slightly to take aim at another alien soldier. With a steady hand, he released an arrow, which sailed silently through the air, finding its mark in the armor of a scout. The alien dropped instantly, his weapon clattering to the forest floor. Zor's head snapped in the direction of the sound, his eyes narrowing in frustration and disbelief. These humans, armed with nothing more than primitive weapons, were cutting down his soldiers like they were nothing. "Form a defensive perimeter!" Zor barked, his voice tinged with anger. His remaining soldiers clustered together, forming a tight circle, their weapons raised defensively. Hayes, watching from above, smirked. They were playing right into his hands. He signaled to his team again, this time instructing them to reposition. The humans moved swiftly and silently, using the branches to traverse the canopy. They took up new positions surrounding the alien perimeter, forming an invisible ring of hunters around the disoriented aliens. Below, the alien soldiers were growing increasingly agitated. Their breaths were shallow, their eyes darting around in search of their hidden enemies. They clutched their weapons tightly, fingers poised on triggers, ready to fire at the slightest sign of movement. But the humans were ghosts, appearing only long enough to strike before vanishing once more into the trees. Zor clenched his fists, his patience thinning with every passing second. "Show yourselves!" he shouted, the frustration evident in his voice. Another arrow flew, striking an alien square in the chest, followed quickly by another, and then another. The aliens fired back wildly, their energy blasts illuminating the foliage, but they hit nothing. Their advanced weapons were useless here, where visibility was limited and the forest was thick with shadows and distractions. Zor's expression grew darker as he watched his troops fall one by one, each loss a reminder of his misjudgment. A low growl escaped Hark as he attempted to steady his aim, but he too was rattled, his confidence shaken by the relentless assault. These humans were supposed to be easy prey, yet here they were, outsmarting and outmaneuvering his team at every turn. Hark fired into the trees, the energy bolt sizzling as it struck a nearby branch. But the humans were gone before he could even see them. A brief flicker of fear passed through him, and he clenched his jaw, refusing to let it show. Meanwhile, Hayes watched his team's precision with a sense of pride. They moved as one, each member in sync with the others. Every shot was calculated, every movement coordinated. The aliens, for all their technology, lacked this unity, this understanding of the land. They were foreigners here, out of their element, and outmatched. Hayes could see the strain on Zor's face, the desperation in his eyes. The realization was sinking in. These humans were not the helpless primitives they had assumed. As the alien perimeter began to collapse, Zor ordered a retreat, but Hayes was prepared. He raised his hand, and his team moved swiftly, closing in on the aliens from all sides. Arrows rained down upon the scouts, each one finding its mark with deadly accuracy. The forest seemed to come alive, swallowing the aliens in a storm of leaves and shadows. Zor stumbled as he tried to escape, his once gleaming armor now smeared with mud and foliage. He was no longer the confident leader who had mocked Earth's primitive inhabitants. He was a hunted animal, desperately fleeing an enemy he could not see. "Captain, we need air support!" Hark shouted into his communicator, but his voice was met with static. The humans had disabled one of their drones earlier, just enough to disrupt their communication. Hark's face twisted in frustration as he slammed his communicator against his armor. Without air support, they were trapped, forced to rely on their own failing technology in a forest that seemed to conspire against them. From his perch, Hayes grinned, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. His team had outsmarted the aliens at every turn, using their own arrogance against them. These invaders might have superior technology, but here in the heart of the jungle, human resourcefulness reigned supreme. The aliens, stripped of their technological advantages, were reduced to prey, vulnerable and exposed. Below, Zor tripped over a tangled root, his pristine armor tarnished, his pride shattered. He glanced around, his eyes wide with desperation. Shadows danced around him, flickers of movement that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. He was surrounded, and he knew it. For the first time, he felt a pang of fear, a visceral realization that he was facing a force beyond his control. Just then, Hayes climbed down from the tree, his steps soft on the forest floor. He moved with the confidence of a predator who had already won, his presence calm and steady. Zor spotted him, eyes narrowing with a mix of fear and defiance. He reached for his weapon, but Hayes raised a hand, motioning for him to stop. "You should have stayed on your ship, Commander," Hayes said, his voice cold, carrying a quiet finality. Zor hesitated, his hand hovering over his weapon, but something in Hayes' gaze stopped him. There was no anger there, no malice, only a sense of pity, as though Hayes saw him not as an enemy, but as a creature that had simply wandered into the wrong territory. Zor's pride would not allow him to surrender, yet he could not bring himself to attack either. He was caught, suspended between fear and defiance, as the forest seemed to close in around him. Hayes turned and vanished into the trees, leaving Zor to face the silence, the knowledge that he and his men had been utterly defeated. The forest fell silent once more, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Hayes' team melted back into the shadows, their work done, their message clear. Earth was not a weak planet, and its people were not to be underestimated. Zor and his surviving men were left to ponder this truth, their pride shattered, their confidence stripped away by a force they had never before encountered. In the end, the aliens had come expecting an easy victory, but they left with a lesson they would never forget. The forest held an eerie silence as Zor and his remaining scouts regrouped, each step heavier than the last. They were cautious now, their confidence from earlier shattered by the relentless ambushes. Zor's frustration simmered beneath the surface, his pride battered with every misstep. What was meant to be a simple mission had turned into a nightmare, and he knew his team was dangerously close to unraveling. Each soldier's armor bore scratches, dents, and mud, the polished sheen replaced by a rough, unrecognizable exterior, evidence of their repeated clashes with an unseen enemy. Hark was the first to voice what was on everyone's mind. These primitives. They're not like any enemy we've encountered. Their skill with the terrain is unnatural, he said, his voice barely concealing a hint of fear. Zor scowled, his usual disdain tempered by the bitter sting of reality. He couldn't afford to appear weak in front of his men, but he felt the truth gnawing at him. The humans were unlike anything they had expected, turning the very environment into a weapon. Their strength lay not in brute force, but in adaptability, a concept foreign to his highly regimented force. We need to adapt, just as they have, Zor finally admitted, his voice tight with resentment. He turned to Hark, who nodded reluctantly, recognizing that they were no longer in control. Disengage cloaking mechanisms, they'd become useless here. And arm all units with the short-range scanners to track heat signatures. We can't allow any more surprises, he ordered, knowing it was a weak response but the best option they had left. The scouts adjusted their equipment, and the forest, once a quiet refuge, seemed to close in on them. They were on edge, every rustle of leaves or crack of a twig setting off an almost instinctual flinch. They moved cautiously, sticking close to one another, as if sheer numbers might shield them from an enemy they could not see. Zor's command to proceed carefully was almost redundant. Fear had already made his men hypervigilant, their eyes darting back and forth, wary of every shadow. From their hidden vantage points, Hayes and his team watched with sharp-eyed attention. Each alien was marked, their positions noted, and their new movements analyzed. The humans knew that the aliens were recalibrating, responding to the relentless ambushes. Hayes whispered instructions, reminding his team to stay patient. Their strategy was working, and now was not the time for haste. If the aliens thought they were adjusting to the terrain, they were wrong. The humans had layers of defense in place, ready to activate at a moment's notice. Rena, one of Hayes' most seasoned hunters, noticed a faint glow just beneath the underbrush. She dropped down silently, her practiced gaze recognizing the faint remnants of alien technology. Her discovery confirmed Hayes' suspicions. The aliens were not just reacting, they were setting traps of their own. Rena's discovery showed that Zor and his men were learning, attempting to mimic human tactics. The balance had shifted, and the humans realized they would need to stay one step ahead if they were to maintain their upper hand. When Rena reported her findings to Hayes, he processed the information with a cold calculation. His instincts warned him that these were no longer simply arrogant scouts. They were survivors, soldiers beginning to think like hunters. If they want to set traps, we'll make sure they're the ones caught in them, Hayes murmured, formulating a new plan. He understood that this battle wasn't just about force. It was about who could master the landscape and use it to outsmart the other. He signaled to his team, pointing them toward positions that would allow them to draw the aliens into their own traps. The humans moved swiftly, each taking up a spot that would maximize their coverage without sacrificing stealth. Hayes knew the aliens were feeling cornered, and in their desperation, they would be more likely to make mistakes. His strategy was simple: use their aggression against them, let them charge into danger headfirst, and trap them in their own ambitions. The aliens advanced, their scanners beeping faintly as they tracked the thermal signatures of the humans. Zor felt a rush of satisfaction as one of the scanners picked up a nearby heat source. He gestured silently to his team, signaling them to prepare an ambush. The humans might be adept at hiding, but now he had a way to flush them out. Zor felt the surge of superiority creeping back, certain that this time, he would turn the tables. But as they closed in on the source, a shadow darted across their path, drawing their attention just long enough for the humans to act. Suddenly, the ground beneath the aliens gave way to a camouflaged pit, dropping 2 scouts into a cleverly concealed trench filled with sharp, improvised spikes. Zor cursed under his breath, watching his men stumble into a trap that was both brutal and primitive. The forest, it seemed, was a willing accomplice in the humans' defense. Zor's vision blurred with anger and shame, each failure a reminder that he was outmatched by a force he had dismissed as inferior. Hark, witnessing his comrade's fall, quickly gestured for the team to retreat, but the humans had anticipated this. Another series of arrows rained down from above, each shot carefully calculated to drive the aliens into tighter, more confined areas. Zor's irritation turned to frustration, his soldiers dropping one by one as the humans closed in with relentless precision. Hark's scanner emitted a faint signal, detecting another presence, but the humans had already adapted. Hayes's team had minimized their heat signatures, blending almost seamlessly with the cooler temperatures of the forest floor. The aliens, over-reliant on technology, were struggling to keep up with the humans' adaptability. Their scanners beeped sporadically, and each time they turned toward a signal, it faded before they could lock onto it. Exhaustion began to show on Zor's face as the weight of the battle pressed down on him. Each time he attempted a new strategy, the humans had a counter, an unseen contingency lying in wait. He was trapped in a cycle of desperate actions, each one leading to a dead end. Hark's voice crackled over the communicator, a faint tremor betraying his shaken confidence. "Commander, we have to consider retreating," he said, the words almost foreign to him. Zor's pride resisted the suggestion, but he could no longer ignore the truth. They were outnumbered, not by sheer count but by strategy, by knowledge of the terrain, by adaptability. He glanced around, seeing the faces of his remaining soldiers, each one weary, afraid, and beginning to lose hope. With a heavy sigh, he nodded, hating the word even as he spoke it. "Retreat," he ordered quietly, the finality of it settling like a weight on his shoulders. The humans observed the aliens' withdrawal with cold satisfaction. Hayes and his team watched them retreat, knowing that they had won not through sheer force, but through patience, strategy, and an intimate knowledge of the land. As Zor and his remaining men stumbled away, defeated and broken, Hayes felt no need for a final attack. The forest had done its part, and the aliens had learned a lesson they would never forget. Zor and his troops vanished into the shadows, their arrogance replaced with a bitter humility. The forest closed in behind them, the silence broken only by the distant calls of unseen creatures. The retreat was supposed to be swift and orderly, yet each step felt more like a stumble. Zor's pride had taken as much of a beating as his team, his usual confidence worn down by the relentless ambushes and the brutal efficiency of the humans' tactics. Every attempt to regroup had only led them deeper into the forest, with each failed maneuver leaving more of his soldiers scattered or defeated. What had started as a mission to survey this backwater planet had turned into a fight for survival, a twisted nightmare of shadows and unseen threats. Zor's hands tightened around his weapon, frustration simmering beneath his strained composure. But just as they thought they'd found a reprieve, a new sound cut through the air, a low, faint rumble from the ground beneath them. Zor and Hark exchanged a wary glance, realizing that the humans hadn't let up. They'd simply been waiting for the perfect moment. Without warning, a series of explosions detonated nearby, sending earth and shattered tree roots into the air. Zor threw himself to the ground, narrowly avoiding the blast, while a few of his soldiers weren't as lucky, disappearing in the smoke and chaos that followed. Hayes watched from a distance, eyes narrowing as he surveyed the aftermath. His team had set those explosives well in advance, knowing it would push the aliens further into unfamiliar territory. With each move, the aliens were falling deeper into traps laid with a precision that Zor's team had yet to comprehend. The humans had anticipated every retreat, every regroup, positioning their forces in such a way that the forest itself became a labyrinth of confusion for the aliens. Recovering from the blast, Zor struggled to his feet, his heart racing as he attempted to assess the situation. "We've underestimated these humans," he muttered bitterly, his voice barely a whisper. The others looked to him, fear plain in their eyes, waiting for some semblance of a plan. But for the first time, Zor felt the helplessness settle in, a gnawing realization that his technological prowess and advanced weaponry meant nothing here. They pressed on, more cautiously this time, but even this adaptation seemed futile. Hayes and his team kept them on edge, allowing brief glimpses of movement only to vanish as the aliens turned to engage. The effect was deliberate, a tactic to drain the aliens' morale and heighten their paranoia. Zor could feel the tension in his soldiers as their movements grew slower, more hesitant, each of them realizing that every shadow, every sound could be another trap waiting to spring. Desperate, Zor signaled to Hark, ordering him to use the remaining drones to scan the area, hoping for a clear escape route. But the dense foliage disrupted their signals, each attempt met with interference that scrambled their readings. Zor's frustration grew into outright anger as he slammed his fist into his armor, his patience eroded by the humans' relentless tactics. He hadn't come here to be toyed with, yet it was he and his men who were being hunted. Suddenly, a figure moved just beyond the edge of their vision. An arrow cut through the air, piercing the shoulder of a scout, and the soldier staggered, clutching at the wound as he fell to his knees. The aliens were scattered now, disoriented, as the humans closed in from every angle, each attack brief but deadly. Hayes and his team moved with lethal precision, using the forest as an extension of themselves, slipping through the underbrush with a silence that seemed almost supernatural. Zor knew they couldn't hold out much longer. He felt the bitter sting of his own arrogance, realizing too late that these humans had turned their weaknesses into strengths. The dense forest, the limited visibility, everything that should have hindered them had only made them stronger, more adaptable. Zor glanced around, his heart heavy with the realization that retreat was no longer a viable option. With one final, desperate order, he instructed his remaining men to fight until the end. It was a last stand, one born not out of hope but of stubborn defiance. If he was to be defeated, he would not go quietly. The aliens regrouped, weapons raised, forming a loose perimeter as they prepared for one last attempt to hold their ground. Hayes observed from the shadows, watching the once arrogant commander, now reduced to a cornered beast. He saw the desperation etched into Zor's face, the thin veneer of confidence cracking under the weight of defeat. There was no need for further ambushes. The humans had already won. Hayes signaled to his team, giving them the go-ahead to make their presence known, each one stepping out from their hiding places, emerging from the trees like phantoms in the dusk. Zor's eyes widened as he saw them, humans, armed with primitive weapons, yet with the fierce, unbreakable spirit of seasoned warriors. He swallowed, pride and bitterness mixing in his throat as he raised his weapon one last time. But Hayes took a single step forward, his calm gaze meeting Zor's with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. He spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of 1,000 silent warnings. "You should never have come here." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Zor hesitated, weapon still poised, but something in Hayes' eyes forced him to lower it. There was no longer any purpose in fighting. His defeat was absolute. Every ounce of arrogance, every assumption he'd made about these humans had crumbled under the weight of their resilience, their ingenuity, their quiet, unshakable defiance. As Hayes and his team faded back into the forest, Zor stood motionless, the silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. The realization settled over him, a bitter clarity that burned hotter than any weapon. He had come here expecting conquest, an easy victory, and had left with nothing but the knowledge that Earth, and its people, were not to be underestimated. Behind him, the forest reclaimed its quiet, the shadows deepening as dusk settled in. The last of Zor's soldiers retreated silently, carrying the weight of their defeat with them. They had learned a lesson that would linger long after they left this planet, a reminder that some battles could not be won with technology alone, that some worlds held dangers invisible to even the most advanced eyes. In the end, it wasn't just a loss for Zor and his team, it was a realization, a reckoning. The humans, with their simple weapons and silent unity, had turned the forest into a battlefield, proving that they could defend their world against forces far beyond their own. And as Zor disappeared into the fading light, he knew that the humans had won something far more than a single skirmish. They had won the respect, however bitter, of a species that had never before known fear.